All right, good morning, everyone. It is this week's edition of our lead meeting, and we have a full agenda planned for you today on this what feels like a beautiful spring day. Would like to acknowledge all of our state tournament sites, especially those that are being held in the high schools, and whether it's a prelim wrestling site or individuals and or state, our ADs and their staffs that are hosting these tournaments. Fantastic job. We've had a great experience. In those tournaments we've already completed, we crowned 6 state champions in dance last week and 8 in Nordic and Alpine skiing combined. And so we are in tournament time officially, and great to see those contests being played last night. A number of look like really good games out there. So for this week, we have our agenda looks like this. We received further guidance, and Laura, if you could go to that agenda. As of last Friday from the governor, and Eric's going to touch on that. What we've noticed here as we head into postseason, or what we've experienced, an update on that, along with spring sports, our competitive section update with appeals taking place last week, and then we'll finish with quick takes again this week. I'm going to turn it over to Eric at this time to update us and assist us on what we hear and what we are seeing from the governor's update.
Thanks, Bob, and good morning, everybody. Thanks for being a part of LEAD on an ongoing basis. As we know, things continue to move, and everyone's anxious for more freedom and more opportunity. And certainly, as we move towards spring and get teams going outside, there's a additional energy saying hopefully things can look a little bit different. Yet there's a lot of guidance that still is very focused on health first and foremost. So. One of the primary aspects is the outdoor pod size has grown from 25 to 50. That does allow for some different ways to do your practices with your teams and think about how you might organize. Yet social distancing remains the key. And as we've seen through the winter, close contacts is a significant challenge. So we did see some really creative things through the course of the winter and how to arrange your practices, even to some of the dance routines that created social distancing even throughout their routine. So really be working with your coaches in advance of getting outside with spring sports to say, how do we do things in larger groups, but continue to maintain that space. Venue capacity changes. The indoor and the outdoor actually has moved from 25% to 50% in seated areas. And remember that it's always the lesser of the totals there. And so lesser of 50% and 250. So no one should be more than 250. And again, that is the spectator side, when you can keep the spectators 12 feet or more from the participants. That also applies to outdoor. So as you're thinking about your spaces and thinking about getting ready for outdoor, whether it be practice or competition, consider ways in which you can make sure and maintain that barrier. Again, I think the fatigue on the COVID precautions is starting to creep in a lot of places. Just maintain that and have good plans in place that do that. As I went to a few of the wrestling sites this last week, certainly saw the value of things like caution tape and so on, just as real clear lines as far as where they should be. Again, remember that everything is around a focus on health. And within that, we've got to promote that culture of honesty and health and have people take the best possible precautions. We're at a point in the winter season right now where everyone is highly cautious, and that's with good reason. Remind your coaches, if there is a student athlete that is even in any way somewhat compromised on a health perspective, they should not be participating. They shouldn't be around your team. You should take the precautions necessary to, one, keep them safe, but then also keep the rest of participants, both for your team and for the other team, in a good place. Recommendations continue around routine testing with everyone going back to school. And I talked with the principal's advisory, had a great conversation with them on Monday, and nearly everybody is working their way toward in-person. And they're thinking about some of the larger events in the spring of the season as well. But routine testing and getting into a way to do that on a regular basis is important. It will allow schools to remain open, because what happens is we identify those cases, address those, and get those to stop right there. They are requesting and recommending that when and where possible, that individuals who are competing in anything that has close contact be tested 3 days prior to a competition. And so look for ways that can be done and implemented effectively. And then obviously the masks are the ongoing question. It appears to be a signal for lots of folks about where and when can we wear masks. There are some flexibilities around outdoor individual competition, but they come with a number of different aspects to that individual competition. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that in a future slide. But again, don't just take that as a blanket of, if it's an individual sport, you don't ever have to wear a mask, because everyone going to practice should have a mask on as they attend. And then there may be spots where they would take them off during that time. But that's just a quick overview. Again, that showed up on Friday. We did get information out, but your two primary focal points for looking things up would be the youth sports guidance and also Stay Safe Men. And those are the two places where you can find this information fastest, I would say. Bob, I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, and Eric, just to reiterate, those larger venue increases in capacity will take place on April 1st. So when we're down at the XL Energy Center with the girls semifinals in hockey, we're looking at increasing numbers of spectators there. Interesting enough, as we work with our large venues, things like Target Center are looking at a capacity of 1,200 for Timberwolves games. So we continue to work on that. We continue to hear from our large venues that bands should not be hosted or will be difficult to host when we get to our tournament venues as well. So we'll continue to work with our venues and those spectator sizes as we get to them. When we look at postseason, right now we're in our sections for hockey and gymnastic and basketball. State, obviously, we're diving, I believe, and swimming will take place this week. I mentioned individual wrestling and state prelims. Just remember, we've said this all along, that postseason will look and feel different if we're not doing things, as we said, by protocols and guidance during that regular season. Number of coaches, state dance this past weekend, you had 3 coaches that were allowed in with that admin rep. Admin reps did a great job with their teams. If there were coaches above and beyond that, they were not allowed to come in with the team and had to go into that spectator pod. Let's keep those pods separate to the best of our ability and minimize opportunities for spread. We're also going to talk about roster substitutions during the postseason and 2 ways in which those can take place. Eric or Laura, anything I missed here?
I don't see anything there, Bob. I think you got it. I think it's an important time. So certainly paying attention to the rosters is going to be key and critical as we go forward.
So with our rosters, there's really 2 ways that you can substitute participants within that roster. There is, according to our general rules and policies, your typical way to do so in terms of a medical clearance, where that doctor would pull an athlete out and would also clear them to come back in, and you can substitute that way. And then there's our COVID quarantine that has to do with quarantines itself and movement for rosters. Remember that there are 2 different ways to do that. That required medical clearance looks like this. There needs to be documentation from a physician, that's not your trainer, that indicates that a student on the certified roster at the time of that first competition, at the level of competition, must not participate. This student may be returned to the tournament squad upon certification with the physician clearing that student athlete to come back, and it would be replacing that student from the roster that they filled in for. And again, this can happen at every level of postseason. If you have a subsection level, your roster can be different than your section roster. And if you make it onto state, that roster can be different. And again, those rosters are certified at that first competition by that tournament manager, official score, whatever the case is. May be different than, let's say, your tournament roster or your program roster. In many cases, that roster, that certified roster, is at the first contest at each level of postseason. Work with tournament managers, whether it's at the section level or at the state tournament level, if you have questions on roster substitution. Laura or Eric or Jody, anything I missed there that should be clarified?
I think the clarification there, Bob, is that there is not an official form for this. The communication is that doctor's note that moves to the tournament manager.
Correct. All right. So the second option is really that postseason quarantine form. Again, that's used for participants who are in quarantine and may become eligible later in the tournament. We had some of that last week. They would be identified, and this form needs to be signed by you if you're the activities or athletic administrator. This is another option. This is for that asymptomatic student athlete that is quarantined, coming out of quarantine, and not to overload our healthcare system, that flexibility to change the roster. This is another option to do that in quarantine situations. On either roster, if you know that a student athlete is going to become eligible during your tournament, the easiest way to always do that is put them on the roster and leave them there. Less is more this year during COVID, right? Having a minimum number of participants is okay, and not bringing student athletes from different levels that compromises your pod or could increase the potential for exposure is another good method. So putting that student athlete on the roster, even though they may not be able to participate at that level of contest or at that level of postseason, is another option, and a very easy option for you. All right, I think that's it there. Laura, we can move on. All right, spring sports. Eric, update us a little bit as to where we're at with masks and what we're hearing.
Yeah, so when it comes to sport participation, masks continue to be required as a part of that. And we need to look at each one of the sports individually to identify what does that mean and what does that look like. So again, we think about indoors, and right now masks are required indoors for all sports at all times. That's going to apply to badminton as we continue forward here. Obviously, synchronized swimming is not going to be a part of that. Anything in the water, the mask can be removed when you enter the water. So that's important. As we move outdoors, they remain required for all team sports. And so when you get to the individual side of things, masks can be removed in individual competition, and it's specific to being able to maintain a social distance amount. And so there are going to be some aspects that we'll continue to provide additional guidance on how you might do that best. But as you're preparing to practice, and as I've had experience in spring sports, there's a number of those individual sports, thinking about track, et cetera, that it's hard to maintain that social distance during training. So again, having students have masks and wearing those would be appropriate. Yet when individual sports are competing, and with some adjustment perhaps to how things are played or competed in, you can then start to remove those masks for the competition part of the spring sports as we get outside. So again, additional sport specific information will be provided, but continue to prepare your coaches and your participants to be wearing masks as a part of their spring sports in the times when it's appropriate. Bob, we'll go back to you.
All right, great. And we're spending a lot of time continuing to look at where we're at with the increase in some capacities starting April 1st and what that means for track and field. You're going to see that guidance continue to flex, continue to change, and continue to show flexibility to really offer opportunities for all of our track teams. We know that we have smaller teams that need access to events, and how can we assist that within our protocols and guidance? And how also can we do our best to assist those very large programs, and what that looks like without compromising MDH guidance in a safe setting with track. We know that that will continue to change and be updated as we're able to gather information for you. As Eric talked about what that individual competition looks like both for golf and track field, we believe those are individual sports at this time, and Eric identified how that works with masks. Again, as we look at the sport of golf, starting to hear some multi-team events, as we've typically noted, that maybe are being canceled, thinking that multi-team events can't occur, right? So if there's a multi-team golf event, a number of teams might look like a total number of 16 would be very appropriate, just like our dance tournaments. You organize them in groups of 4. You might have 4 different teams. You might have a Lake City, a Wabasha Kellogg, and Randolph, or Rushford Peterson having foursomes in each group made up of those 4 schools. You may send them off the front, you may send them off the back, and once that group of 4 teams is done, you could move on to another 4 teams. Think about that as how we did it in terms of a dance perspective with many of you. and what that looked like, that is something that can take place within those multi-team events. Yet what we don't want to see is we don't want statewide competitions, multi-team competitions, exceeding in some cases 20 to 30 schools, right? That's going to look like that typical invite or greater than multi-team event that again is going to increase opportunities from bringing more communities together, more potential of spread if there is COVID. And we know we are still dealing with that, as many of our sports and teams are limping to the finish line. We want to continue to play. So just remember that those multi-team events can be done. We want to compete and we want to leave. The gathering or other items that take place around a tournament-like setting is what we want to try and prevent from occurring early on in that spring season, making sure that we can continue to play. Out-of-state competition, remember that we're looking at a 50-mile distance if you need to travel across state lines to compete, and understand what you're traveling to or what's coming to you. If they're coming to you, they can travel greater distance, but that can continue to be a regional event, and think about that spread or what it looks like or what COVID looks like in those parts of the state. Recommendation for dance. Let's get outside. Let's get spring sports going. And I think dance tryouts can continue by law and policy this spring, yet our recommendation is that you would do so after May 1st. Let's get our teams outside. Let's minimize those indoor spaces for those spring sports, and then dance tryouts can occur. And that is a recommendation, again, that they begin on May 1st or following May 1st. Eric, Laura, anybody else, anything I missed with our spring sports?
I just think it's a good reminder for folks that that we dig into the guidance from the Department of Health very carefully, and where things are required, we try to make sure that that those are required. But we also build our guidance off of their strongest recommendations. And I think you did a great job talking through things like multi-team events and any kind of out-of-state competitions, et cetera, and how do we reduce those for the purpose of extending the season and giving everyone the opportunity to continue all the way to the full completion of a season, including our state tournaments. So important stuff.
Very good. Let's move on here. Just a reminder, voluntarily, you can begin that 5-day arm conditioning. Here's what bylaw 504 number 2 does say. Can begin next week in this case. It is a 5-day organized conditioning program trying to get those arms in shape. That's prior to the first 2 weeks of baseball practice. Here's what the spirit of this bylaw is intended for. Equipment, things like baseballs, gloves, catcher's equipment, working on that arm care conditioning, working on preparing that arm ready, getting it ready, and your physical conditioning ready for that season. Things like bats, batting cages. That is not the intent of next week as that begins. Again, strength training, aerobic conditioning, those types of equipment can be used. Again, that is voluntary for you, and it's 5 days starting next week, and hopefully we have weather like today, and we can do so outside. We also send an update on that out to you, and make sure that gets to your baseball coaches if there are questions. All right, moving on to competitive section placement. We talked about the number of appeals that were reviewed and scored last week by our AD's advisory. They did a fantastic job of being consistent and making recommendations to the executive committee of our board. That has taken place. We have started working on section placements of teams by sport. We're making progress with that. And again, that will be completed and approved by our board, or we hope it will be approved. It'll be presented to our board on April 15th, following the conclusion of winter sports. And then we know we also have district football waiting in the wings here, and that work is in process as well to the best of our ability. I believe, Laura, we're going to turn it over to you to conclude today with quick takes.
Great. Good morning, everyone. Just a few notes for you. Again, as we send updates to you, we try to balance sending you not an update every day, but also not letting them get too long that they become overwhelming. Want to draw attention to the update that you received yesterday because it was different from many of the ones that we send. Many of our updates are dominated by COVID guidance. This one really was not. In yesterday's, there was quite a bit of information about getting your spring coaches in and registered. Those sports-specific rules meetings are becoming available early next week. So having your spring coaches in and registered before that will be helpful. Reminder that for your spring sports coaches, they have 3 requirements. They are required to do a concussion course. That is a once every 3 years, and this is the first year of that. Your spring sports coaches, along with all coaches, are required to do a general rules meeting. And then for almost every activity, they are also required to do a sports-specific rules meeting. Those first 2, the concussion and the general rules, those are there for them already. So when they get into their account, they will see those now. They won't see the sports-specific ones until those are released early next week. Another piece that was in there, and again, depending on who manages this within your office, we're providing you an opportunity to print your own state tournament participation certificates. We heard from a number of people that continues to be a challenge with managing your copiers and not getting enough. So that has now been turned over as an opportunity for schools to do. There are directions in the update and directions on the right side of your dashboard with templates of video and other resources for you or anyone else in your office to manage that piece. There's also a piece that's been added this year to provide you the opportunity, if you have a state tournament team participation, you can provide an MVT certificate, most valuable teammate, to 1 person on each of those teams. And that information is also on that page. Yesterday also, MNI AAA provided information to us for registration for their spring conference. So if you do not receive that on your own, that MNI AAA registration was there yesterday. And then also there was information about the last head coaches course that's being offered before summer. So if you have any head coaches who need to get in, that is the last one that will be offered until summertime. Know that once your coaches start to move through those rules meetings, you have access through that coaches education report to download a spreadsheet of those and start to be able to sort and figure out who has done and who hasn't done which of those pieces. So again, lots of things in yesterday's update. As Bob did reference, we will also be sending you an update today. It'll have 2 items only in it. One will be the baseball arm conditioning piece. And then we'll also do a summary of the postseason roster substitution piece. So you have that in writing. Know that we continue to communicate with ADs and need you to forward those messages on to those who may need it. So the one that comes out today about arm conditioning, please make sure that your baseball coach also gets that. It's being posted on their dashboard, but you are really the alert to tell them to go and look for that item. So with that, I'm going to turn it to Bob for the last slide.
Yeah, and Eric, if there's any further comments that you would like to, one thing I failed to mention in the arm care piece, so that is an example of a team sport, remember, so they still have to be masked participating in that voluntary 5-day arm care. Also got a question here, a couple of questions. We'll watch MDH guidance, things like track meets and spectator lists. And again, we currently operate under spectator lists. You need to have those prior to events. We'll continue to watch that and look at what that looks like for outdoor events in a sport like potentially golf and or track. And then also those admin reps. When you're coming in hockey and basketball, I can speak to specifically, they will be arriving with the team, need to be with that team. You will go through a COVID check, so to speak, or screening with your team. You'll come in with that team while they're participating. You'll be in an area separate from that spectator pod. So in a sport like hockey and basketball, also anticipate an admin rep that would typically be responsible for spectators. You can expect that as well. And then they will assist in exiting those arenas. Again, our large venues are going to be very tight. in terms of protocols that are taking place, where you can and cannot go. The emphasis is going to be the competition. Come in and play, and then we leave as quickly as possible, again, to minimize exposure. Again, I'll use dance as an example, and went very well. And I think we prevented some things from occurring upon the completion of the competition. Eric, anything else you'd like to reiterate or emphasize that may have been missed?
Yeah, I just think when it comes to venue capacity and you start thinking about those spring sports, had some questions around what happens after April 1, right? When those start to grow. And again, we shared the percentages of 50% up to a maximum of 250 right now. That does start to expand after April 1, but it does not continue as 50% of whatever your size is. And again, remember, managing where people are going to be and what that looks like. It's not just say, well, our venue can hold this many and let them in. It starts when you get above 250, it starts talking about either 25% of the remaining capacity or even 15 or 10. So you're going to want to look at your space very carefully. Some of you are doing a really great job with your admin team to do venue calculator to identify what could our capacity be. But again, those don't change until after April 1, very specific to your spring sports. And think about what your stadiums might look like, what your track facilities might look like, and what that could offer as you get a little bit closer. And those numbers are out there. Again, the numbers of like 10,000, those are really brought on by the Minnesota Twins and not designed necessarily for the State High School League. Yet we do have some extensive facilities in some places that can offer some greater access. So again, use that information. If you have specific questions, as always, feel free to reach out.
Very good. I think that's it. Next week's meeting, I believe we're going to Wednesday. We're in tournament time. We're going to again do our best to get you the most effective and efficient information. Continue to be impressed by the number of conference and groups of schools that meet following these meetings to digest what we're presenting. We're going to continue to offer you that information as timely as we possibly can, even during our tournament season, while we're also creating our competitive sections. Have a great day. Enjoy the rest of your week here, and feels like spring today. Have a good day.